Here's another of my favourite little synths, the MaxiKorg or the Korg 800DV. Now this was part of Korg's early 70s range of monophonic synths, which consisted of the 770, the 700 and the 700S. And these were used by artists as diverse as Kitaro, Vangelis, Human League and a load of others. Now the 800DV was duophonic, as indicated by the DV, i.e. dual voice. And with this instrument we're talking what I like to call proper duophonic, because each voice could have a totally separate sound. And that's because the 800DV or MaxiKorg was essentially two 700s, the latter being known as the Mini Korg, hence the moniker MaxiKorg for the 800DV. Now, to put this line of instruments into perspective, in 1973 when this was released, the world and his dog were progging out to the sounds of Moog and Arp. So for Korg to introduce a slightly oddball line of synths, with names like Traveller for the filter, was probably a bit of a risky thing. But American synths were expensive here in the UK, and in a stroke of marketing genius, a few of these little Korgs started appearing in your mum's Littlewoods catalogue. Now this meant two things for somewhat skint adolescents. Firstly, a distraction from the underwear pages of the said catalogue, and secondly, easy payments. Yep, you could buy a synthesizer in a catalogue and spread the payments out over several weeks. In fact, OMD bought their Korg Micro preset via the same catalogue and paid £7.76 a week for 36 weeks. The MaxiKorg was only available in proper music stores though. So let's have a look at the controls of just one of the synths before seeing how the two synths interact. Starting in the top left, we have the coarse and fine tune controls for the upper synth. Coarse tune gives you about 6 semitones either side of a centre indent. Fine tune is all very self-explanatory, so let's not dwell on this and instead move along to something more interesting. Something called a Traveller, and note the single L in Traveller. Now this is the filter section, with the upper slider acting as a low pass filter and the lower slider acting as a high pass filter. Now you'll see there's a little notch which stops the sliders from crossing over. And I know of loads of people who've actually cut these off, which is really tempting, but it's also sacrilegious, so I haven't done it with this instrument. Anyway, resonance is via a little three-way switch labelled bright, which has a normal flat setting, plus extension 1 and extension 2. So self-oscillating filters are completely out of the equation, but that's not what this instrument is about. Next we have the expand switch, which effectively gives 3 filter envelope or contour settings that when used in conjunction with the Traveller sliders and the bright switches provides some real versatility. Now, here we have an attack slider giving instant or slow attack. We also have a percussion slider giving options between percussive and singing. And these are also used with the adjacent 3-position switches, the first of which gives control over decay. So in the middle we have normal, in the top position we have short, and in the bottom position we have long. To me it sounds like long is about 10 times normal, but I've not measured it, so don't take that as gospel. The adjacent hold switches are also 3-position and are reasonably— again, in the middle is normal, In the lower sustain position, the length of the sustain is governed by the singing slider. And finally, in the upper hold position, again depending on the position of the singing slider, the note will hold indefinitely, even after you release a key. So while we don't have a traditional ADSR envelope, this section is still reasonably powerful, and it's fairly simple to create anything from really sharp percussive tones to slow attack and long release drones. And that's before we've even got to the waveform section, or VCOs. Here's where we set our octave range from a super low 64 foot right up to 2 foot. Next comes the waveforms section. And here we have a triangle for those soft and muted sounds. Square for nice hollow sounds. A sawtooth for those kind of string and brass type sounds. Pulse width for reed-like tones. Chorus for some fatter tones. Now the speed of this chorus is controlled by the vibrato slider over here. And finally, pink noise. Actually, that's about the only difference between the upper and lower section. Pink noise in the upper and white noise in the lower. Now, the thing about the world back in the early 70s was just like your car or the size of your flared trousers, the amount of VCOs on your synth was indicative of the size of your penis. The Mini Moog with its 3 VCOs was the kind of John Holmes of the synth world. Your 2 VCO Odysseys, etc. were your normal misogynistic studs, and single VCO instruments were quite often laughed out of the locker room. Still, dodgy 70s analogies aside, the 800 DV had a natty second VCO per voice by way of a simple sawtooth generator with 5 different octave positions. Once selected, you then adjusted the balance between the VCOs via a mixer knob here. Here's your main VCO. And here's your additional VCO. Now, there's no fine-tune adjustment between each of these VCOs, so you're never going to get anything massively fat, but you can get pretty good results by utilising the chorus waveform in the main VCO, and then pitching the second VCO an octave up or down. Not only that, but it also has a ring modulator. And alright, it's not particularly powerful, but it's good to use so you can make things a bit gnarly when necessary. Next we have the modifier section, and it's here where we find vibrato, bender and portamento controls. And firstly, we have the vibrato switch, with which we can choose from off in the centre, normal, which is the same as continuous in the upper position, and delay in the lower position. Now this works in conjunction with the vibrato speed and depth sliders here. Here's normal or immediate, and here's a delayed vibrato. Likewise, with the bender switch in the centre position, no pitch bend occurs, but pushing it up gives you a 1 octave downward bend, and in the lower position you get a 1 octave bender up. With the associated sliders here, we can adjust the time interval at which the pitch bend occurs and the bend speed. Now, portamento or glide gives you the option of nothing again via the centre position, a fixed rate in the upper position, and variable in the lower position. In the lower position, you can then adjust the rate of the glide using the slider. Next are the volume controls between the upper and lower synths. Now there's a bit of an organ drawbar thing going on here because down is up in volume and up is down in volume, which is a bit mental at first, but you do get used to it. So this is probably the perfect time to introduce the lower synth and set up a different sound. So we drop the upper synth volume to 0, turn up the lower synth, and used what we've learned to create a different sound. Okay, let's introduce both synths into the equation. Now if that's all this instrument did, I think I'd still be happy. But it gets better because we have a couple of tricks with triggering options via the two sections on the far right. Firstly, here's what's confusingly referred to as the key transpose section, but in truth it's more of a key triggering section. With A and C selected, when a key is played, both synths will be heard. With B and C selected, when one key is played, only the upper synth is heard. All keys to the left of this note will play the lower synth. With A and D selected, when one key is played, only the lower synth is heard, and all keys to the right of this will play the upper synth. With B and D selected, it will only sound when two keys are played at a given time. Keys to the right will affect the upper synth, and keys to the left will affect the lower synth. Finally, we can use the repeat section to re-trigger notes in all manner of ways. Now there's a couple of sliders here which change the rate or speed of the re-triggering, and just think of this as an LFO speed slider. Then the second slider affects the wave shape from a simple square in the centre position to a pulse. The dial then selects a number of modes from off to A, whereby only the upper synth repeats, B, only the lower synth repeats, C, both synths repeat at the same interval, D, repeats both synths at differing intervals set by the wave shape pulse width slider, and finally E triggers the upper synth first and then the lower synth. Now this can lead to some seriously creative possibilities. For example, we can set up a bass repeat on one synth, in this case the lower one, and then play melodies with the upper synth. Or how about in C mode, we trigger both synths at the same time, add the ring modulator to one synth for a bit of gnarliness, and ramp in its attack time. Or we move it to D so that the upper and lower re-trigger sequentially, then we set one synth an octave above the other before using the waveform slider to give us that kind of triplety groove. Or we can have each synth triggering sequentially to create a single global patch. And that's it really. It might not have been a rival to the Mini Moog or Odyssey, and it might not be full of crazy modulation possibilities or sound effects galore, but it really has a character of its own, and the sounds it imparts are bloody great. Now this entire series of Korg synths, the 700, 800 DV, 770 etc, was superseded by the MS-10 and MS-20 towards the end of the 70s, and while they're undoubtedly great instruments, with the reissues now available, their sound is more commonplace, whereas that early Korg sound isn't. So if you see one for sale at a reasonable price, definitely check it out.